Good morning, everyone. Welcome to everyone here in the room and joining us online. Very big welcome for me to the Institute for Government. I'm Hannah White and I'm Director of the Institute. And I'm delighted you've joined us all here today for this conversation with Sajid Javid. Before we kick off, just a few housekeeping points. We'll be live tweeting from IFG events using the hashtag IFG Centre. So do use that if you wish to tweet, if you haven't been put off using Twitter by Elon Musk's antics over the weekend. Do send in any questions. If you're joining us online, you can do that using the Slido screen, the panel on the right of your screen. And we'll have a video and sound recording of the event on our website within 24 hours. So, as you will all know, Sajid Javid has held some of the most senior roles in British government, having been Home Secretary, Chancellor of the Exchequer and Secretary of State in 6 government departments. And we're really delighted that he said he's going to stand down at the next election, but he's joined us here today, and we're particularly delighted that he's joined our Centre Commission, which is a 1-year project which we have set up to think about how the centre of government works in the UK, how Number 10, the Treasury and the Cabinet Office work together, whether they're working as well as they can, and we're planning to come up with some proposals, some conclusions by February next year, which hopefully will inform everyone's thinking ahead of the next election. And we're really pleased to have Sajid's wealth of experience brought to that commission. So today we're going to be just starting to draw out some of that experience with some questions from me. And then there'll be an opportunity for everyone in the room and, as I've said, everyone online to throw in their questions. So, welcome, Sajid.
Thank you.
A very nice, easy one to start with. What do you think works well about the centre of our government, and what could work better?
Well, thank you. First, thanks for having me. And I thought you said at the start in the introduction that you were delighted that I decided to stand down.
Oh, no.
So I didn't know that delighted the IFG, but anyway. What works well and what doesn't at the centre of government. Look, I think that obviously one of the reasons you've said at the Commission and that why I'm supporting is I think there are definitely improvements that can be made in how government in the UK is run, central government. But it's good to sort of just to start off with what works well, because there's a lot that goes right in our country. We're under successive governments. We're the 5th, 6th largest economy in the world that generates hundreds of billions in taxation that pays for things that so many people rely on, from education to health to social protection to defence and fighting crime and all of that. And I know that it's just thinking about my constituents as a constituency MP that we can always find fault with lots of that, and there is bits and pieces of that are clearly we need to massively improve on. But I think when you certainly compare to some of those to other countries and things, there's a lot that goes right. And also just how fierce our democracy is in terms of obviously the electoral competition, a whole sort of the broad system of democracy in this country. I mean, there's a lot that works well. In terms of what's not going so well is maybe we get into some of this a bit later, but I just say like 2 or 3 things immediately just from my experience. I would say that having worked in in those different departments and some of them you mentioned, but also for 3 different prime ministers, that I think first of all I'd say that the Prime Minister's office is not as sort of strong and expert in things as I think it should be in a country the size of ours with all the responsibilities that government has. Obviously, the Prime Minister of the day has an office, and there's lots of people in it, and there's lots of good people in that. But given when you compare that to the sort of the awesome set of responsibilities, the overall size of government, the size of individual departments, I think it's very hard for the Prime Minister of the day, with the support that he or she has, to sort of stay on top of things and push the Prime Minister's priorities. The second, I would say that we don't do cross-government working well between departments. So obviously I've been in many different departments and things, and obviously each department has its own priorities, as you would expect. But some of those priorities are clearly government priorities, and they can only be properly met or efficiently met if the rest of government, other government departments are also doing their bit. Take health, for example. I was a big champion of more preventative healthcare. But to do that, it's not just the health department. You need the education department, you need the culture department, you need the welfare department. So, how do we do better cross government? And then the last thing that comes to my mind is, how can we improve things at the centre government is broadly put, I'd say, talent. And I'm not just, obviously, that starts with you've got the ministerial level. How do you, some ministers are good at their jobs, some are not very good at their jobs. But then, if you work your way through the system, I think we're blessed with fantastic civil servants, and I think that overall my experience with civil servants has been very good, and I think the vast majority are very good, and I'd be proud that they serve the way they serve our country. But there are also some, like in any big organisation, that are not very good, and it's really hard to fire a bad civil servant. It's almost impossible, and then also finally on talent. That we clearly need experts in government as well. Most civil servants are generalists, most MPs and therefore ministers are generalists. We need experts, especially if you look at some areas like today, a lot of discussion around AI and technology and things and health and things. You need experts. And I don't think that we are, at the moment, necessarily always attracting the best experts in an area, not least because the public sector as a whole is not willing to pay enough for those experts.
Right, there's lots of excellent material for us to get our teeth into there. That's really interesting. But I mean, I guess the starting point is to say none of those problems are new. So the IFG's Centre Commission is obviously hoping to come up with some new ideas and thinking about how to tackle them. But we have known that some of these things haven't worked at the Centre for a long time. And so why do you think it's so difficult to address these problems? Why haven't we solved them before now? Why do we need a Centre Commission?
Because first, you're right. I mean, none of those are really new. And why do they prolong as they do? I think that one thing is, I think that whenever a prime minister comes into office, they will have their set of priorities, and they're in a bit of a rush to get things done. Yeah. So even if they've come at the start of they've just won an election, so they're new prime minister, they've got maximum 5 years to make a difference, and then get the next verdict of the electorate, and that, I think. 5 years might sound like a long time, but if I think that when you sort of arrive at number 10, then someone presents you with these problems and things, and maybe you already know about these issues, and you start thinking, well, okay, we're going to have a machinery of government change, we're going to get more experts in, we're going to do this, then someone else will say, not without some merit, say, well, if you're spending so much time changing around the machinery of government, what about your pledges? Because no one voted for you because you said, I'm going to have more, better committees, I'm going to pay public servants more and things like that. Right? None of this stuff I'm talking about is in your manifesto. You might have some vague line about making government work better, but you don't have a section on this in your manifesto. You're going to be focused on your commitments. And then especially that's a prime minister at the start of a term. When then you have prime ministers, as we've seen recently, like 3 prime ministers in less than a year, and now with an election, less than 2 years away, the priority is sort of delivery rather than dealing with these issues, and I think there's always a sense that these are real issues, but we'll come back to this at some later date, but you never really do.
And one of the reasons for that, of course, is that the unexpected happens, and we've seen, and you've been in government through a really tumultuous period with first Brexit and then COVID. What lessons did you take away about how government deals well with those situations, but perhaps where the centre could do better, and where we should be focusing our thinking about when there's a crisis underway rather than the business as usual, which you think you're coming into government to deal with? How could the centre be more effective there? Yeah, well,
I think that if you take those sort of recent challenges, even if we go back a bit further, the most recent sort of crises certainly in our memories, you start with the financial crisis, and then of course the pandemic, and then to some extent the war in Europe as well. If you look at government response to crises, it does get the machine going and working in a much more sort of flexible, even innovative way that doesn't normally happen. And I don't know whether you're pointing to this, but I've often just thought that, how can you sort of harness that sort of what happens in a crisis and make it, you use that sort of energy to have that kind of, let's say, more radical or more flexible approach during more normal times. And I think that just, if you just take the COVID crisis, that, there was a lot there that the government did because it was such a big crisis that it sort of almost threw the sort of normal sort of rule book, the normal approach out the door and said, look, okay, if we're going to get a vaccine, then let's go and sign up for 8-9 vaccines and see which one works. The Treasury would never have done anything like that in a million years without a crisis like that. Or the sort of retention program, salary retention program, what the size of that, how quickly it happened, and all of that. But I think probably the answer to your question, why don't we sort of see more sort of energy like that in more normal times? I think just when the crisis is gone, that there's just no driving force to make such radical change. And also, actually thinking about it, I think in government, within government, you'd think, well, when you take a more radical, more sort of out-of-the-box approach, it's in some sense, it's a riskier approach, right? But you can justify it to the public, right? So, look at take the vaccine example. We invested in 8-9 different vaccines, only ended up using a couple of them. Someone might say, well, hold on a minute, didn't you waste money on the other 6 or 7? But then the government can turn around and say, look, if I hadn't done that, I didn't know which one was going to work. So, and there's a really good sort of argument that most sort of people would accept. But outside of a crisis, it's really hard to justify that because in government, it's quite risk averse. Civil servants are risk averse. Ministers become risk averse, and of course. Without the crisis, that it just makes it harder to sort of explain to the public why you took a riskier than otherwise approach. Yeah,
I think that's interesting, although I think this is a question about whether we now need to see dealing with crisis as a sort of permanent capability of the centre, because particularly with the climate crisis, it seems likely that there are going to be more unexpected events, things that the centre is going to have to deal with, and that rather than seeing it as an aberration, as what you do when you stop, actually that needs to be a permanent capacity at the centre, which is what you're talking about.
I think, again, we talked about some of the crises that are the best known and some of the most impactful, but if I think of my time in government, we used to have a lot of Cobra meetings, right? Because it'd be like a crisis or a mini sort of crisis or issue. When I was Home Secretary, with the Salisbury poisonings, we had, just take that, we had regular meetings of Cobra, and that led to, the whole government machine, especially with the Cobra meeting, right? Because you're literally in this room. Typically the Prime Minister's chairing it, or then as Home Secretary, I might be chairing it, but you have to come to this meeting. There's no ifs, ands, and buts. The whole sort of Cabinet Secretariat is working towards it, producing the agenda. It's the only meetings, and just take that example in government that I've ever experienced, where as you make decisions, there's screens around the room, live screens, and someone's typing away, and the action points are appearing. So you're just agreeing to those actions as they're appearing. And if you're Secretary of State and you've got you look at the screen and there's some, point 2, point 3, point 4 as they're appearing, if you've got any different view, you've got to say it there and then. Otherwise, as soon as you leave that meeting, those things will be actioned and the Secretary of State won't even have to tell the department, the Cabinet Office will do it. And it just happens, right? Now, obviously, you can't take such an approach to everything, tackling homelessness or serious violence and things like that, which require cross-government approaches, to take those two as an example. But there is a method that already exists in government that in crisis or mini-crisis, that we can make the whole machine work a lot more smoothly. And I think we've got to try and find ways to harness that.
So when you were in line departments, so you had a number of jobs in the Treasury, but when you were in a department looking at the centre, how does that feel? What do you need from the centre as a line department, and what do you get at the moment? Is there any mismatch there?
Yeah, so first of all, what do you need when you're running a line department? I'll put the Treasury aside. It's different to most departments, and you might want to come to that later. But with all the other departments, the spending departments, all the 5 departments around spending departments, and obviously you've got some clear objectives. So when you become Secretary of State of a department, you would have inherited some objectives. There might be some in your sort of manifesto that are, like the sort of almost non-negotiable. But you will also have your own sense of priority. I mean, every Secretary of State does, and I think that basically you sort of try to work on all those, and you don't. Most Secretaries of State, I think, would try not to involve the centre unless they have to, right? It's not. I think the departments feel quite a sort of separate from. Obviously, they're part of central government, but it goes back to my point of lack of cross-government working. Is that most departments, obviously, you've got your Secretary of State, all your civil servants answer only to that Secretary of State, and you will obviously have junior ministers in the department, you have your SPADs and things, but you'll, as a team, you typically sort of come to an understanding of what the priorities are for your department, how to focus on those. So you don't tend to, I think, go to the centre unless you really need the centre. And now it depends also on what we mean by the centre, because the department that you will go to a lot is the Treasury, right? Which is not the same thing as going to number 10, right? And that is probably the department that I'd actually think of it as for spending departments as a central department, as part of the centre, but as almost you've got the Prime Minister's office you're dealing with, and you've got the Treasury you're dealing with, and as a Secretary of State you have to deal with both. But I think you'll probably have more interaction with the Treasury because you can't spend any money without the Treasury's approval. You won't get the budget, and even if it's not a spending money issue, the Treasury is the one department that, even if it's a new rule or regulation you want to introduce, got nothing to do with money. If the Treasury doesn't like it or really wants to see it happen, it has a huge degree of influence on you. So I think most Secretary of States will have much more sort of direct relationship with the Treasury.
And do you think that the way that Secretaries of State tend to approach that militates against cross-government working? So if you're involving the centre less, then...
Yes. Yeah, it does. And that, there are just so many challenges for each department that are cross-government, right? And so, I could take so many during my time, serious violence. So when I was Home Secretary, sadly, knife crime and thing had been rising for a long time. How do we tackle that? Obviously, it's the lead for the Home Office, but to actually deal with, there's many other departments involved. If you think about the criminal justice system, you've got obviously the Justice Department, you've got the AG's office, then you've got other departments, education for trying to help young children that might get drawn into crime and things. So I set up a serious crime task force and had other ministers around the table as well as people from outside government, and it had some success and things, but it's really hard to get traction if you set it up yourself and things. You really need the centre, which means the Prime Minister, to lead that and to set it up with you. If I give you another example where that happened, is that when I was the local government secretary, I was determined to get rough sleeping down. We had a manifesto commitment, it had just been going up and up, and it was obvious that it wasn't a cross-government priority. I went to see the Prime Minister of the day, which was Theresa May, convinced her that we need a sort of new ministerial committee that she's got to set up, her office is set up, and she should come to the first one, and all this kind of stuff. And it did the trick. And, we got all these departments agreed, and they all did their bits, and it started to move the numbers in the right direction. But it's a huge amount of effort to do that. Now, it's worth the effort, but the thing is you can't do that for every single priority you've got. So you sort of think you want a better mechanism for cross-government working so it becomes more of a norm.
Yeah. Turning to your time at the Treasury, do you think there is such a thing as Treasury Orthodoxy, and is it a problem?
Yes, there is. As in, if you mean Treasury Orthodoxy, is there like a sort of common way of thinking or approaching issues? You said, is it a problem? I think it depends. When people say Treasury Orthodoxy, it seems to me it's sometimes it's a sort of catch-all thing, and often it's like someone's not getting what they want. But sometimes there can be a good reason for that. So let me explain that. If by Treasury Orthodoxy, some people are sort of saying, well, they're really difficult with spending and they're not raising this tax or to give me more money or whatever. Whereas often no department is saying raise a tax, by the way, right? So Treasury is the only department that raises money. Every other department is a spending department, including number 10, right? So the Treasury, the Chancellor is the only person sitting there thinking, where's this money going to come from? And obviously there are consequences when you raise money, right? You either raise taxes or you raise debt, but there are sort of bigger consequences to that if that gets or it feels it might get out of control. So, if by Treasury Orthodoxy people mean that the Treasury is always sort of looking to sort of balance the books in the medium term, let's say, I think that's a good thing, right? Because someone's got to look out for balancing the books. Because imagine that kind of orthodoxy didn't exist, you'd have a constant financial crisis, right? And let's take a more recent example when, I'm certain that the Treasury would have told Liz Truss when she was in office that if you go out with a budget that's going to blow the deficit and without any sort of narrative, any sort of laying the ground or any plans to bring that under control, even over the long term, the markets are not going to like it, right? You're getting a massive negative reaction. The Treasury would have that's orthodoxy at work, and she ignored it, and the country paid the consequences. But there are aspects, I would also say, of Treasury Orthodoxy where I think it does need to be more flexible, right? And that's not the balancing the books bit, although there is a relationship. And that is, I think that the way the Treasury looks at investment, and especially sort of any genuine things that a government could do basically to invest to save, right? So what could you do that might be upfront cost now more than the Treasury had anticipated, but will genuinely lead to savings? And I can give you so many examples of where that would make sense. Health department, let's say the NHS is the biggest budget in the government. It's obvious that hospitals need more investment. We need more capital equipment, and we should be investing more in technology there, right? And it will definitely save money in the long. If all hospitals had electronic patient records, it will definitely save money in the long term. The challenge the Treasury always has with that is that the long term for them is 5 years, right, maximum, right? And those savings, if they're going to come 8, 9, 10 years down the line, it's the interest just falls away, and the Chancellor of the day is often just pushed to sort of how are you going to manage those books over the next few years. And so I do think that there should be a sort of proper look at changing the approach to sort of longer term investment. And I think also, now someone else might say, listening to that, think, well, hold on, wouldn't that lead to more borrowing now or something? And I think that can be managed as long as it was explained. And again, you've got to lay the groundwork, set out your plans, take the time to do that so that markets understand why this is actually long term going to lead to less debt, not more debt. So I think there are ways to do that. But whenever you sort of approach that in the Treasury, again, it's sort of, there's just too many forces that to say, look, that's not the approach, it's not how we've done it. I think that's a bit of a problem. And then just to finish on that, I think that there is an issue around how Treasury accounting works. In that you have the sort of the day-to-day spending is called resource spending. Any sort of broadly sort of long-term spending is capital spending, but those distinctions aren't very clear. So they are clear in some areas. If you build a road, that's clearly capital spending. But what if you want to invest more in skills? Is that capital? Is that day-to-day resource spending? And the Treasury can make changes, but it's not just up to the Treasury, and that's the final point. So it's up to the ONS, and obviously that's completely independent, as it should be. And I'll give you a more recent example. In the last few years, the Treasury was able to convince the ONS to change how R&D spending is accounted for. Now 80% roughly of R&D spending is capital spending, Whereas go back 10 years and it used to be all resource spending. And that was a very sensible change, but it took years to convince the ONS to do that. So there are some issues there.
And when you were Chancellor, do you feel like you were part of that Treasury Orthodoxy and upholding it on behalf of government? Or were there times, can you give any examples of when you sort of had to push back against it from within?
I think all Chancellors, again, I think it depends what aspect of, there's not one single orthodoxy. So as Chancellor, did I want to make sure that, certainly in the media, we're balancing the books, that we have fiscal rules of? Absolutely, right? I mean, no Chancellor should want anything different, right? In terms of, it's sort of self-evident that you've got to be able to manage the books. But your question was, did I challenge all? Yeah, I mean, I did it in my first time in the Treasury, right? As soon as I arrived in the Treasury, that was a few years back as the Economic Secretary. That was my first role in the Treasury. And one of the things I saw in my sort of objectives was the government had for a long while, governments had wanted to issue a British government Islamic bond, like called a sukuk, it's referred, but it's sovereign Islamic bond. And Gordon Brown had tried it and not proceeded, and before I arrived, and George Osborne had looked at it and not proceeded. And so I took some interest in this, not least because I'd come from working in finance, and one of the areas that I ran for the bank I worked for was the Islamic financing unit. So I thought I know a bit about this. And so anyway, we looked at this, and the bottom line, the Treasury would always kill it because they'd give advice to the minister and then ultimately to the Chancellor that would say that this bond would have to pay a higher interest rate than regular gilts because it's structured and it's going to be highly illiquid, and you have to pay a liquidity premium and all that. And so they'd say you have to pay an extra 1.5%. And obviously, that, from a taxpayer's point of view, that's not a good outcome, right? But they were wrong, right? I was absolutely convinced they were wrong. And not only did I believe they were wrong, I believe that actually you end up paying maybe slightly less interest. And that's because they weren't pricing in something called scarcity value, right? And because the UK would have, at that point, been the only major industrialized nation to issue this type of bond. And the Treasury wouldn't change its advice and things, and they were saying, if you want to do this, you've got to get the Chancellor to issue a direction, otherwise we're not going to do it. So eventually I asked to meet the Perm Sec, who was Nick McPherson at the time, and I took him through all my reasoning, and ultimately he sort of agreed, but he said, this is your risk, right? If this doesn't work out, you could lose your job. You've just started in the Treasury, this is not a good start if you get the wrong way. So then I had to go and see George Osborne, and then he said, are you absolutely sure, Sajid? And I said, I'm absolutely sure that it will come less. Now, actually, looking back now, why would I stick my neck out something like that? I don't know, but I just felt that this was not right, and we should do this, and I was right. And so anyway, end of the story is that we issued the bond, and I'd said that it would come in about 0.25% below Treasuries. That was my estimate, low. I was wrong. It was 1% below, right? It was even cheaper. But my point was absolutely correct, and the Treasury accepted it in the end. And then now, since then, they've issued a couple of these, right? And every time, it's what I've said. But the point is that that would never have happened if the Treasury hadn't been challenged. And for years, governments have been trying to do this, and the Treasury had been stopping it because of its orthodoxy. And the problem there, by the way, is that the Treasury is full of tons of smart people, and they're fantastic in so many ways, but they don't have much market experience. And even the ones you'd expect that work in like markets departments and things, they don't have that experience, and so they don't they don't have all that experience of how markets actually work and may think.
That's really interesting. I could go on asking you questions for a long time, but I think I'm going to have to give everyone else a go. We have a roving mic in the room, so anyone who wants to ask a question, let me know. It would be great if you could give us your name and where you're from, because that's always interesting. So we'll take a group of questions, and I'll also take some from online. So Maddie, just right next to you there.
Hello, Robert Shrimsey from the FT. I was just reflecting on your last point, Sajid, as to whether, in fact, therefore, the problem at the centre is ministers. not civil servants, if there aren't enough ministers who feel expert enough or able enough or have managerial experience enough to take on civil servants, how much of the problems that we have been describing are actually down to that?
So, do you want to
take
take that? Okay,
take
fine.
another one. Just the gentleman in front.
Hi there, Ben Tretter from Nesta and the Behavioural Insights team. I'm just wondering if there's any other countries in your experience that you think get this really right and that you were kind of looking to when as a minister or at the centre and going, I wish we were structured like that? And if so, what are they doing that's working so well?
Do you want to take those two? Because they...
Yeah. Actually, those, in my mind, those questions are connected. In that, I mean, I do think there's a problem with the talent of some ministers, right? Some ministers, definitely, I can think of ministers that are absolutely suited to the job and the right person at the right time and all that, but also the opposite is true. And of course, ultimately, the minister is leading the department, certainly the Secretary of State, and if they're not suited to that job, then, no one would expect much out of the department. So that is an issue, but it's a really hard one to crack in that, because why does that happen is because for every prime minister of any political party over decades is that when you appoint ministers, you're not just thinking of talent. I mean, obviously it's a factor, but it's not the only factor. There's so many other factors that go into appointing those ministers. And I'm not, personally, I don't know how you change that in any sort of meaningful way. Now, you could have a set of mitigants around that, so if you, and this will happen, there will be, now and in the future, there will be appointments of ministers that, a prime minister may even know is probably not the best person to do that job, but I've got to appoint him and her to that job. So you might build sort of mitigants around that, maybe with some stronger junior ministers, maybe more oversight of the department, maybe taking away some of the responsibilities of the department and putting it somewhere else. But I accept that there is an issue, and I think that's probably generally true of most countries, and certainly if we compare ourselves as we should to liberal democracies, I think it's probably an issue in most countries. Now, there are different approaches to different countries, and just was linking it to, I think it was Ben's question. And some countries, France, US, others, but let's look at European countries, perhaps a bit more comparable in terms of parliamentary democracies, where you can bring experts in, and they are made ministers. So, as you know, we don't do that. And of the advantage, I think, is obvious that they're an expert. There's a disadvantage though as well. They're not elected. They have no constituents. It's hard for them in a parliament, to sort of to answer questions in a way that that sort of they can claim at least some knowledge of what the public might think. And no one's voted for them; they've been appointed, and so there are sort of pros and cons there. And if we did that in the UK, we might be having a different question about why are unelected people being given so much power. And then you asked me about other countries. I mean, I'll give you an example. This will never happen here. It won't happen in any other country, but you can see why it works in this particular country. That's Singapore. I was having a breakfast a few weeks back with the health minister of Singapore, a friend of mine. And I've known this about, I used to live in Singapore. I lived there 3 years before I came into politics. And I knew this at the time, and he just reminded me that, that ministers in Singapore, their cabinet, their salaries are over $1 million. Right, a PM's salary there in Singapore is $2 million, and similarly with civil servants, their salaries are very high. Now the cost of living in Singapore is about the same as London, and so the salaries are huge. And what they do in Singapore is they index salaries of ministers and senior civil servants to the private sector. The PM salary there, for example, is indexed to CEO salaries. They take CEO salaries of the top companies in Singapore, and as those go up and down, the Prime Minister's salary moves up and down. And they get a very, very high quality of people wanting to go into politics and wanting to be ministers. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying we should do that here, but there is something in that. If you have a Secretary of State for Health that is getting paid probably half the salary of the permanent secretary in the department and stuff, that you're expecting people to do these jobs for something other than income, and a lot of people do that in the public sector, as they should. but there's a level where I think the quality within government starts to suffer, and it's also with experts. I talked about civil servant experts as well. I think recently I think I saw some news about the Treasury. I think it was trying to hire an AI expert for something like £70,000 or something like that. Now, £70,000, don't get me wrong, it's a lot of money, right? But it's not going to get you an AI expert, when companies are paying 10 times that. So, and ultimately, people will suffer because you don't get the experts in government. So, I think salaries has something to do with it as well.
I just wanted to sort of build on the point there that you're making and ask whether you think we should be worried that actually there's a lot of expertise and experience that's going to leave Parliament, given the number of MPs who've said, like yourself, that they're standing down. Just building on Robert's question, should we be worried that actually Parliament's going to lose a lot of expertise? Of course, we do bring people into the House of Lords and create precisely that unelected expertise. Sometimes people are brought into the House of Lords to be ministers. Because of their expertise, but then we pay them even less than we pay MPs. So, I mean, we have the worst of all worlds there.
I think that there are lots of reasons that MPs will be standing down, but one of the issues, not just in this Parliament, in all the sort of, as we get to the end of each Parliament, obviously MPs leave, and there'll be lots of reasons, but one of the reasons, I think, either people leave or you're not getting more sort of diverse background of people as in different professions and things as well, wanting to join Parliament, is I think salaries is an issue. An MP salary is, I think, £88,000 at the moment, and again, it's a lot of money. It's more than double the national average, but you get what you pay for, right? You get what you pay for. If people want to see GPs or nurses or senior nurses or head teachers or an accountant, give up their job to want to come into Parliament, they have going to take a massive fall in their lifestyle to do it, and a lot of people are not willing to do that. So, you either you attend there to get in Parliament, therefore, either really rich people that don't need money, and therefore they don't care if their salary is 88,000 or 28,000, or you will get people that were earning sort of 30,000, 80,000 is a big jump, but they might not come with the skills that Parliament needs. So if I had my way, I would halve the number of MPs and double the salaries. Right? It wouldn't cost the taxpayer a penny, and you'd get a much higher quality of Parliament and ministers.
Some more questions in the room. I'll do this gentleman here and the lady here.
I was for some years one of those very expensive consultants. In fact, I was the most expensive consultant for many years, working on the gilt swan, the thing that manages the national debt. And I found a couple of things which I think need to be taken. One was the strange mode change between the senior civil servants when I was introduced as someone who understood the gilt market, had done economics and was a director of a bank. And when they discovered I was actually the chief technology officer of the bank, their attitude visibly changed between those who saw me as a technologist, and therefore one of them, and those that saw me as one amongst themselves. Which is the civil service seems to have developed what I first saw at IBM, which is a very commercial organisation, that as an organisation gets bigger and older, the ratio of effort that it is rational to spend looking good to other people in the organisation relative to the amount of effort to actually doing your job gradually changes in looking good inwards. And a lot of the civil servants' behaviours, I noticed, which differentiated us from the bank mostly, was that so much of it was to stay looking good. I mean, there is this talk of civil servants' agendas as if they're left or right or something. But there is just this general, if you want to fit in, if you want to be promoted, you have to be, am I going to say you have to be white? Yeah, I'm just going to say this. You look at the diversity of the senior civil service and you compare it to the top tier of the Conservative Party, which is, when all is said and done, the right-wing party. The senior civil service has a lot of women. Any other sort of diversity really just disappears. So how do we alter the ratio of them looking more out than inwards? I think that is the hard question.
You want to pass the along, and then we'll come forward to you.
Hi, Jessica Frankies from City AM. I'd be interested to know your thoughts as a former Chancellor on the economic situation facing the country at the moment. What do you make of Rishi Sunak's approach as Prime Minister, being 100% on it and urging people with mortgages to hold their nerve, and of the performance of Andrew Bailey in tackling inflation? Thank you.
There's a few questions there. The lady in the front row.
Hello, Zanet Bukarte from My Rights UK. You said that government is risk averse, and we kind of know that, but you also said that there needs to be more investing in technologies. So what's the way to solve that, and what would be your commentary on the future of access to justice / legal tech, health / med tech from the perspective of government, and what should startups do if they want to work more closely with the government? Thank you.
Thank you. A variety of questions there.
Yeah, no, thank you. On your first turning to the gentleman's question, I mean, there's a lot there, but your central point about diversity, I think, is absolutely right. So I came into Parliament in 2010. By 2012, I was a minister and stuff. For almost 10 years, I've been working with civil servants as the minister or as the Secretary of State. So a lot of contact with civil servants. And as I said earlier, as I said, the vast majority of civil servants I work with are very good people. They work really hard. They're very intelligent and stuff. And I was happy, very happy with that overall. But I think diversity is definitely a problem. It's improved. If I think back to my time in the Treasury when I first started, and even when I came back to the Treasury as Chancellor many years later, I think diversity, both in terms of gender and racial and also social background, there are improvements. I remember as Chancellor, I meeting civil service was really keen to show me some new people that had joined that all come through apprenticeship programs and come from different social backgrounds. And they were keen to do that because when I was the Economic Secretary many years earlier, I was making a big issue of diversity and lack of diversity in the Treasury. And that's the problem across the board. And I think it doesn't solve a lot of, you mentioned a lot of issues that result from this. It may not necessarily solve all those, but I think having a more diverse background, civil servants and ministers, for that matter, it can only help. It can only be a good thing that you get the difference in ideas. You get more creativity, more innovation, and there are many programs now in the civil service to try and improve this. But I hope that one thing that maybe this commission, the IFG Commission, can look at is how do you really turbocharge that, because it sort of almost feels like it hasn't kept up with what's happening in Parliament and with ministers. The civil service hasn't really kept up with that sense of change. On was it Jessica, the questions on the economy? Look, obviously there's serious economic challenges. There are for us, there are around the world. I think the Prime Minister is right to set his priorities out sort of economically, and first is to make sure that the system overall, not just the government, but of course the Bank of England and everyone is doing everything that they can be reasonably doing to tackle inflation, and then also to focus on growth and to get the debt down. Now, those are really three massive goals, but I think the Prime Minister set the right goals. I'm not going to it's too early for me or I think for anyone to say whether all those goals will be achieved in the way the Prime Minister wants. But I mean, broadly, I'm happy with the government's approach. And one thing we didn't touch on earlier in sort of related to this is that when it comes to the economy, obviously the Prime Minister of the day has a huge role and influence, but so does the Chancellor. And the relationship between the Prime Minister and the Chancellor is crucial, the quality of that relationship. And I think we once again now have a Chancellor and a Prime Minister that work very well together. I think they see eye to eye on all the big issues. I know that their SPADs and advisors are well coordinated. I think that is a good thing as well for anyone interested in the healthy economy. And then the third question, technology investment. I mean, I touched on it a bit earlier. I do think it's one of the obvious areas where you could invest to save. And I think you could do that in any part of government. My most recent experience has been in the health department. And again, we talked about how crises sometimes accelerate change. During the COVID crisis, we saw for understandable reasons, the take-up of the NHS app, just to use one example. It went from something like 20% of the population to 80% of the population. And so one of the things I wanted to do was, how do you keep making it relevant post-pandemic to make sure people keep using that, and that you can add more apps and more things on it to get people to keep using it. And that requires investment. And that's one example from the health department. There are many examples across government. AI, for example, I think is going to be absolutely revolutionary. I think it's going to touch every aspect of life. I think there are huge improvements in government that can come from AI. I think right now, every single permanent secretary should be asked to bring in experts and do a full review of AI and report by the end of the year about what they're going to do about it and how they're going to take advantage of it for the delivery of that department, right? Things like that. So I think you've got to have a radical approach to this. I think technology can be hugely transformative. There are pockets of good examples in government. I think, again, to use the AI example, the Prime Minister has brought in with his task force and things, it's all really good signs. We're having the conference later on this year and things. But I think we could do even more. And the last part of your question about how can startups, especially, I think you asked about startups, do more. I think there's been, I might be mistaken, I thought there was a review of this. I don't know if it's been implemented, but I thought there was a review of how smaller companies in tech can get more involved with government. But my short answer would be, I think there should be more of a general approach, not left to every department. I think there should be somewhere in government that a small tech company, particularly a British tech company, can go and be sort of introduced to the right parts of government and sort of handheld through the process rather than just left on its own. I think the Bank of England has got a very hard task to try and bring inflation under control. It doesn't have, like all central banks, it only has a couple of tools in the box, right? Interest rates and one or two other tools. And when you have a situation where inflation, like we've seen the recent sort of increases around the world, where a lot of the causes are structural, there's not much any central bank can do. I think I'm right in thinking the Bank of England was probably, I think, the first of the world's major central banks to start increasing interest rates. And obviously we've seen where that has got us now. I think the bank should be left as it is, completely independent to make those decisions. It's right that no politician is getting involved in that, so I'm not going to opine even now. I think it would be wrong for me as a former Chancellor to say what they should or should not do. But when you look at their recent actions, I think they're rightly taking inflation very, very seriously.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. Thank you to everyone for joining us, and I hope you'll join me in thanking Sajid Javid for a really interesting.
Thank you.